Dear friends, in this story, we dive into the eerie tale of Eliza, who inherits her late aunt's cottage in a quiet, isolated village. Surrounded by misty mountains and dense forests, she arrives hoping for peace but is met with strange warnings from the locals. The house, filled with unsettling occurrences like whispers at night and moving objects, hides a dark secret. As Eliza unravels the mystery, she discovers that the shadows in the house have a far more sinister presence. Let us begin the tale of the shadows beneath. Nestled in the cradle of misty mountains and dense, ancient forests lay the quaint village of Blackwood. The village seemed like something out of a fairy tale, untouched by the modern world, with cobblestone streets winding between half-timbered cottages adorned with creeping ivy. Time moved slowly in Blackwood, its rhythm dictated by the tolling of the church bell and the whisper of wind through towering oaks. This serene facade, however, was deceptive, for a dark undercurrent pulsed through the village, an unspoken truth that the villagers dared not utter aloud. Eliza, a young woman with bright eyes and a determined spirit, arrived in Blackwood with hopes of a fresh start. The passing of her reclusive Aunt Margaret had left her the owner of a modest yet charming cottage on the outskirts of the village. For Eliza, it was an opportunity to escape the chaos of the city and rebuild her life among the tranquility of nature. She had always felt a pull towards solitude and the simplicity of rural living, and Blackwood seemed to promise exactly that. As her car meandered down the forested road leading into the village, the scenery transformed into a lush tunnel of green, with branches intertwining above like an archway welcoming her to a new chapter. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden streaks. It was idyllic, almost unreal in its beauty. Yet, even in this serenity, a faint unease gnawed at the edges of her consciousness, a feeling she dismissed as nerves over the significant life change she was undertaking. The villagers greeted Eliza with a guarded politeness, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. At first, she attributed this to her being an outsider. After all, small communities like Blackwood often viewed newcomers with suspicion. However, as she interacted more with them, she noticed a recurring pattern in their conversations, a hesitation whenever the forest was mentioned, a glance over the shoulder as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, and vague, cryptic warnings about keeping to the village after dark. The forest is unpredictable, one elderly woman murmured, gripping Eliza's hand tightly as if to emphasize her point. Stay away, especially at night. And whatever you do, don't go wandering near the old well. Another villager, a grizzled man with a weathered face, simply shook his head when she asked for directions to the trailhead leading into the woods. There's nothing for you in those parts, he said gruffly. Your aunt knew better than to meddle with things that don't concern us. Despite their warnings, Eliza felt an undeniable pull toward the forest, its looming presence visible from every window of her aunt's cottage. The house itself was quaint, with ivy-covered stone walls, a sloping roof, and flower boxes filled with overgrown marigolds. It had the charm of a place long lived in, though it bore the weight of neglect in recent years. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedarwood and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Dust coated the wooden furniture, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the beamed ceilings, but the house retained a warmth that made it feel like home. The first night in the cottage passed uneventfully, though Eliza couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the creaks of the old house settling or the occasional hoot of an owl outside that disturbed her, it was something subtler, a sensation that prickled at the back of her neck and made her glance over her shoulder more than once. The next morning, she dismissed her unease as the product of an overactive imagination. After all, she was alone in a strange house surrounded by a forest steeped in folklore. It was natural to feel a little spooked. But the oddities began to mount. It started with small, almost dismissible occurrences, a book falling off the shelf with no apparent cause, the faint sound of whispering that stopped as soon as she strained to hear it, and the sensation of cold spots in otherwise warm rooms. One evening, as she was unpacking boxes in the living room, she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the creaky floorboards above. Her heart leapt into her throat, but when she searched the house, she found no one. Then there was the basement. The door was an ominous presence at the end of the narrow hallway, its dark wood marred with strange, almost runic markings carved deeply into the surface. It was locked, and no amount of tugging or prying could budge it. Eliza found a set of keys in a dusty drawer in the kitchen, but none of them fit the rusted lock. The door's existence unsettled her more than she cared to admit. It felt out of place in the otherwise cozy cottage, a stark reminder of the secrets her aunt had kept. Determined not to let her imagination get the best of her, Eliza tried to focus on settling in. She filled the shelves with books, hung cheerful curtains in the windows, and planted fresh herbs in the overgrown garden. Yet, the house seemed to resist her efforts to make it her own. No matter how many times she cleaned the floors, she would find faint, muddy footprints leading from the back door to the basement. Items she distinctly remembered placing in one room would appear in another. And always, there was the whispering, soft, insistent, and just out of reach. One particularly chilly evening, as Eliza sat by the fireplace reading one of her aunt's old journals, she heard a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the sound of a dog or any animal she recognized. It came from deep within the house, reverberating through the walls like a warning. Gripping the iron poker from the fireplace, she searched every room, her heart pounding. But again, she found nothing. The villagers' warnings echoed in her mind, their words taking on a new weight. There was something wrong with this house, something her aunt had lived with and perhaps even succumbed to. Yet, despite her growing fear, Eliza felt an inexplicable attachment to the place. It was as if the house itself didn't want her to leave, its strange occurrences both a test and an invitation. And so, Eliza remained, determined to uncover the truth about her aunt's life and the secrets of Blackwood. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of dread, the feeling that she was being drawn into something far beyond her understanding, something that had been waiting for her all along. The days passed, and the unease in the cottage deepened. Eliza tried to ignore the strange occurrences, attributing them to her imagination, the age of the house, or perhaps the villagers' warnings preying on her mind. Yet, the whispers grew louder, and the cold spots lingered longer, gnawing away at her rationality. She knew there was more to the cottage and the village than met the eye, and her curiosity began to outweigh her fear. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered weakly through the gray clouds, Eliza decided to search the attic. It was a cramped, musty space filled with old trunks, stacks of yellowing newspapers, and cobwebbed furniture draped in sheets. The air was heavy with the scent of mothballs and decay. As she rummaged through her aunt's belongings, a sense of intrusion washed over her, as though she were unearthing secrets that were never meant to be found. At the bottom of an old trunk, beneath layers of folded linens, she found a leather-bound diary. Its cover was cracked with age, and the faint scent of lavender and smoke clung to its pages. The handwriting inside was unmistakably her aunt's, neat and deliberate, but with a certain frantic energy that grew more pronounced as she turned the pages. The entries began innocently enough, notes about the weather, recipes, and musings about the garden. But as Eliza read on, the tone darkened. Her aunt spoke of strange phenomena, whispering voices, shadowy figures glimpsed in the corners of her vision, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One entry, dated 2 months before her death, stood out. They come closer every night. I tried everything, salt at the doors, candles in the windows, prayers to gods I no longer believe in. But it is not enough. The shadows grow bolder. I hear their whispers even in daylight. They want me, but I will not give in. Not yet. Eliza's hands trembled as she turned the page. Her aunt had described rituals she performed to keep the shadows at bay. These included leaving offerings of food and small trinkets in the forest, drawing protective symbols on the walls of the cottage, and burning a mixture of herbs and animal bones at night. Some rituals were more chilling, burying shards of broken mirrors beneath the threshold and mixing her own blood with salt to create barriers against the shadows. The diary also mentioned the village's dark history, tales of people disappearing into the forest, never to return. Her aunt wrote of a curse, a pact made generations ago to protect the village from starvation during a harsh winter. The cost of this pact, however, was steep. The shadows demanded souls, and once they set their sights on a victim, there was no escape. Eliza's heart raced as she pieced together the fragments of her aunt's life. The markings on the basement door matched the symbols described in the diary, symbols of warding and containment. Whatever her aunt had been trying to protect herself from, it had been powerful enough to drive her to the brink of madness. That night, Eliza dreamt of the shadows. They appeared as amorphous figures, their forms constantly shifting, with glowing eyes that burned like embers in the dark. They surrounded her, their whispers a cacophony of despair and promises of release. She awoke drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in her ears. The next morning, determined to learn more, she ventured into the village. At the local tavern, she overheard fragments of conversations, hushed words about the curse and the forest. She approached an elderly man who had been watching her with a wary expression. "Do you know anything about the shadows?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes widened, and he leaned in close, his breath smelling of tobacco and ale. "You shouldn't be asking about such things," he muttered. "The shadows hear everything." "But I need to know," Eliza insisted. "My aunt, she knew something. She was protecting herself." The man hesitated, glancing around the tavern as though the very walls might betray him. "Finally," he said, "your aunt wasn't the first to fall victim to them, and she won't be the last. The shadows are older than the village itself. They take what they want, and no one who crosses them is ever the same." Before she could press him further, he stood abruptly and left, his drink unfinished. The other patrons avoided her gaze, and a heavy silence settled over the room. Eliza felt the weight of their fear, their complicity in the village's dark secret. That evening, as she walked back to the cottage, the forest seemed more menacing than ever. The trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The whispers began again, faint at first but growing louder as she approached the house. She thought she saw movement in the shadows, a flicker of glowing eyes watching her from the tree line. Inside the cottage, the air was oppressive, thick with an unnatural chill. She lit a fire and tried to calm her nerves, but the feeling of being watched persisted. As she sat by the hearth, she heard a knock at the door, a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed through the silence. When she opened the door, she found no one there. But on the ground, just beyond the threshold, was a bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside were a collection of trinkets, an old pocket watch, a wooden comb, and a withered rose. She recognized them from her aunt's diary. These were offerings meant to appease the shadows. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with her. She returned the bundle to the forest edge, placing it carefully on a mossy rock as described in the diary. As she walked back to the cottage, the air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and the shadows in the trees appeared to shift and ripple. That night, Eliza's dreams were more vivid than ever. She saw the elderly man from the tavern, his face twisted in fear as the shadows closed in around him. He screamed, a sound that resonated deep in her chest, and then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, she learned that he had vanished. His absence was met with a resigned silence from the villagers, as though it were an inevitability they had long since accepted. Eliza's resolve hardened. She knew she couldn't run from the shadows, they would follow her wherever she went. If she was to survive, she needed to confront them, to uncover the truth of their existence and the role her aunt had played in keeping them at bay. But as she delved deeper into the mystery, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 3. The descent into horror. Eliza's once quiet refuge had become a living nightmare. The air inside the cottage seemed thicker now, pressing down on her chest and making every breath feel labored. The whispers, once faint and fleeting, now reverberated through the walls, growing louder and more insistent as the days passed. At first, they were merely words she couldn't understand, but soon, they became phrases in a guttural, malevolent tone, all repeating the same chilling command, "Join us." The shadows that had lurked just beyond the edge of the forest now began to invade her home. She would catch fleeting glimpses of them in her periphery, a flicker in the corner of a room, a dark shape crossing the hallway when she was certain she was alone. They appeared in mirrors, too, standing silently behind her as she washed her face or brushed her hair. The glowing eyes stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, vanishing the moment she turned around. One night, Eliza woke to the sound of scratching. The noise was coming from inside the walls, deep and relentless, like claws carving through wood. She lit a candle and crept through the house, her heart pounding. In the living room, she found deep gouges along the walls, claw marks that were too large and deliberate to be made by any animal she could imagine. The whispers grew louder, and as she backed away, she felt something cold brush against her shoulder. Spinning around, she saw nothing but darkness. Yet, the sensation lingered, an icy imprint that felt as though it had reached inside her and gripped her heart. The shadows were no longer content with lurking. They were here, in her home, and they were making themselves known. The shadows strike. As the days turned into nights, Eliza's strength began to wane. Sleep was impossible, the shadows would not let her rest. They whispered to her in dreams and tormented her while she was awake. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like their approach. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. Eliza covered her ears, but it was no use. The words were inside her head, seeping into her thoughts like venom. "You cannot hide," they hissed. "Join us." Suddenly, the storm ceased. The silence was so abrupt that it felt unnatural. The wind stopped howling, the rain no longer pelted against the windows, and even the whispers seemed to hold their breath. Then came the sound, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the basement door. Eliza froze. The door had remained locked since she arrived, the strange symbols etched into its surface serving as both a warning and a barrier. But now, something wanted out. Her legs felt like lead as she approached the door, the old wood creaking under her tentative steps. She pressed her ear against it, and from the other side, she heard it, a deep, guttural growl, followed by the faint sound of laughter. The laughter was distorted, as if it were echoing through a vast, empty space. Then came the voice, low and rumbling, "Let us in." The door burst open with a force that threw her backward. Darkness poured out like smoke, engulfing the room. The air was filled with the sound of wailing and laughter, a cacophony of despair that made her ears ring. At the center of the chaos was a dark, pulsating portal, its edges writhing like living flesh. The room seemed to tilt and sway as the shadows emerged from the portal, their glowing eyes fixed on her. Eliza scrambled to her feet and backed away, her mind racing. The diary had mentioned the basement but never in detail. Her aunt had simply referred to it as the threshold, a place that must remain sealed at all costs. Now, Eliza understood why. The portal wasn't just a gateway, it was alive, and it was hungry. A terrifying revelation. The shadows circled her, their forms shifting and undulating as if they were made of smoke and darkness. They didn't touch her, but their presence was suffocating, pressing against her from all sides. One of them stepped forward, its eyes burning brighter than the others. When it spoke, its voice was a symphony of whispers, layered and disjointed. "You cannot resist," it said. "We feed on your fear, your despair. You have brought us strength, and now you will join us." Eliza shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "I won't let you take me." The shadow laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. "You already belong to us. Your fear sustains us, your despair binds you to us. It was your aunt who kept us at bay, but now her protection is gone. And so, we grow stronger." The weight of their words hit her like a blow. She realized with horror that her fear, her sleepless nights, and her desperate attempts to understand the shadows had only made them more powerful. They thrived on her suffering, feeding on the darkness within her. Desperation gave her clarity. She remembered the rituals her aunt had written about, the symbols and offerings that had kept the shadows contained. But those rituals required strength of will and an unyielding resolve, qualities she wasn't sure she possessed anymore. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Eliza began to chant the words from the diary. They felt foreign on her tongue, a language older than time itself, but she pressed on. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and twisting as if the words caused them pain. "You cannot banish us," the lead shadow growled. "Your fear is too great. You are already ours." The portal began to pulse more violently, its edges splintering and emitting bursts of dark energy. Eliza's voice wavered, but she kept chanting, her hands tracing the protective symbols in the air. The shadows screamed, a sound that shook the walls and shattered the windows. They lunged at her, but an invisible barrier held them back, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. The portal began to shrink, its pulsations growing weaker. The shadows writhed and thrashed, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke. With one final, guttural scream, the portal collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Aftermath. Eliza collapsed to the floor, her body trembling and her mind numb. The cottage was eerily quiet, the oppressive presence of the shadows gone. She looked around, her eyes lingering on the gouged walls and broken windows, evidence of the horrors she had endured. but she knew it wasn't over. The shadows had been weakened, not destroyed. They would return, drawn by fear and despair, searching for their next victim. It was up to her now to keep the portal sealed, to ensure that the curse her aunt had fought so hard to contain did not consume another soul. She picked up the diary and began to read, determined to learn everything she could. The fight wasn't over, but for now, she had won. The shadows had been banished, and she had survived. But the whispers of their final words lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder of their promise. We will be back. The fight for survival. Eliza sat on the cold wooden floor of her aunt's cottage, the diary trembling in her hands. The words written on its yellowed pages were her only hope, yet they filled her with dread. The ritual required not just words and symbols but something far more harrowing. She would need to confront her deepest fears, to offer them up as a sacrifice. Her aunt's warnings were explicit: fear was the shadow's lifeblood, and to face them meant standing against the very essence of terror itself. The whispers around her grew louder, as if the shadows knew what she was planning. The claw marks on the walls seemed deeper, more menacing. The air was charged with their presence, heavy and suffocating. Eliza's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she laid out the materials for the ritual: a circle of salt, candles to light her path, and a small mirror to reflect her intentions. The diary described the mirror as a vessel for truth. It would show her the fears she had buried, the memories she had suppressed. Only by facing them could she weaken the shadow's hold and close the portal. The thought made her stomach churn, but there was no alternative. If she didn't do this, the shadows would consume her and perhaps the entire village. The ritual begins. Eliza knelt at the center of the salt circle, her fingers trembling as she lit the candles. Their flickering light cast long, dancing shadows across the room, and she couldn't help but flinch at their movements. She held the mirror in her lap and began to chant the incantation from the diary, her voice shaky but resolute. The air in the room shifted, growing colder with each word she spoke. The shadows that had been lurking in the corners began to gather, their forms coalescing into darker, more tangible shapes. Their glowing eyes pierced through the dim light, and their whispers turned into guttural growls. As the chanting reached a crescendo, the mirror in her lap began to shimmer. At first, it reflected her own terrified face, but then the image changed. The surface rippled like water, and a scene began to unfold, a memory she had tried to forget. She was a child again, standing at the edge of a lake. Her younger brother, Sam, was in the water, laughing and splashing. She remembered this day vividly. It was the day she had dared him to swim out to the deeper waters. She hadn't meant any harm, but the current had been too strong. She had screamed for help, but by the time someone arrived, it was too late. The guilt hit her like a tidal wave. She had carried this weight for years, burying it deep inside her. Now, the shadows fed on it, their forms growing larger and more menacing. They laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in her mind. "You let him die," one of them hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You failed him, and now you will fail again." Eliza clenched her fists, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was a child." The shadows surged toward her, their clawed hands reaching for the circle. The salt barrier sizzled and sparked, holding them back, but only barely. The diary had warned that the ritual would draw them closer, but their ferocity was beyond anything she had imagined. Confronting the darkness. The mirror's surface shifted again, showing another memory, her father, lying pale and lifeless in a hospital bed. She remembered the moment she had received the call, the guilt she had felt for not visiting him more often. The shadows whispered accusations, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You abandoned him," they sneered. "You cared more about your life than his." Eliza's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The weight of her guilt was crushing, but she couldn't let it break her. She forced herself to keep chanting, her voice rising above the shadows' taunts. The diary had been clear: the ritual wasn't about defeating the shadows, it was about reclaiming power over her fear. She closed her eyes, focusing on the memories, on the pain they caused. "I made mistakes," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I've carried that pain for years, but I won't let it define me. I won't let you use it against me." The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting. For the first time, they seemed unsure, their confidence shaken.
The climactic showdown. But they weren't finished.
The room darkened further, the shadows merging into a single, monstrous form. It towered over her, its glowing eyes filled with rage. The salt circle began to crack, the barrier weakening under the creature's assault. Eliza's hands trembled as she clutched the mirror, her only weapon against the encroaching darkness. She looked into its surface, which now showed her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else, something she hadn't noticed before. The reflection smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, nor was it mocking. It was a smile of defiance, of strength. Eliza realized then that the mirror wasn't just a vessel for truth, it was a reflection of her own resilience. She stood, holding the mirror high. The shadows roared, their voice a deafening cacophony, but she didn't waver. "You feed on fear," she shouted, her voice ringing with newfound courage.
"But I am more than my fear.
I am more than my guilt. You have no power over me." The mirror began to glow, its light piercing through the darkness. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating under its brilliance. The monstrous figure lashed out, its claws raking through the air, but the light was too strong. The portal in the basement began to tremble, its edges splintering. Eliza focused all her energy on the chant, the words flowing from her lips with unwavering determination. The light from the mirror intensified, filling the room and seeping into the portal. With a deafening roar, the shadows were pulled back into the portal, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The portal collapsed in on itself, leaving behind only silence. Unexpected consequences. Eliza sank to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. The shadows were gone, the portal sealed, but something felt different. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, yet there was an emptiness she couldn't explain. She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the broken salt circle and the extinguished candles. The mirror in her hands was cracked, its surface dark and lifeless. The ritual had worked, but at a cost. A sudden wave of nausea washed over her, and she doubled over, clutching her stomach. A voice whispered in her mind, faint but unmistakable.
"We are not gone," it said. "We are a part of you now."
Eliza's heart sank. She realized with horror that while she had sealed the portal, the shadows had left a mark on her, a fragment of their darkness, buried deep within her soul. She stood, her legs shaky but determined. The fight wasn't over, but she had survived. For now, that was enough. As she stepped outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting the village in a golden light. The forest was quiet, the oppressive presence of the shadows gone. But Eliza knew better than to trust the peace. The darkness was patient, and it would wait. For now, though, she would rest. She had faced her fears and survived the nightmare. And when the shadows returned, she would be ready. The dreadful ending. The first light of dawn streamed through the broken windows of the cottage, illuminating the aftermath of the battle. The salt circle was shattered, the candles reduced to pools of wax. The once glowing mirror lay cracked on the floor, its surface darkened. Eliza stood amidst the wreckage, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The oppressive silence that followed the ritual was deafening. The shadows were gone, pulled back into the portal, but the sense of victory felt hollow. As Eliza surveyed the room, her gaze was drawn to the basement door. Though it had been slammed shut during the ritual, a faint hum now emanated from behind it, a low, pulsing sound that made her stomach churn. The portal remains. Eliza hesitated before descending the stairs to the basement, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder as she approached the door, her breath visible in the dim light. She placed a trembling hand on the knob, and the whispers began again, faint but unmistakable. "Eliza," they called, soft and insidious. "You cannot escape us." The portal stood at the center of the room, its edges fractured but still pulsing with an eerie, dark light. The runes around its frame flickered weakly, as though clinging to the remnants of the ritual. Eliza's heart sank. She had sealed the shadows, but she hadn't destroyed the portal. It remained a gateway to their world, a crack in the fabric of reality that could never truly be closed. The diary had not prepared her for this. Flipping through its pages, she searched for answers, for any indication of what to do next. But the words seemed to blur, the ink fading before her eyes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent.
You belong to us now.
Eliza clutched her head, the voices echoing in her mind. She fell to her knees, her vision swimming.
The portal's light grew stronger, bathing the room in an unholy glow.
She felt a pull, a deep, visceral connection to the shadows, as though they had claimed a part of her during the ritual.
Bound to the shadows. The truth hit her like a blow.
The ritual had not freed her, it had bound her to the shadows. She was their sentinel now, the one tasked with guarding the portal and ensuring it remained closed. The cost of her victory was her freedom. Eliza staggered to her feet, her resolve hardening. If she was to be their sentinel, she would not let them claim another soul. She would remain here, standing watch over the portal, even if it meant sacrificing her life. As the day wore on, she prepared the cottage for her new role. She reinforced the salt barriers, scrawled protective runes on every surface, and armed herself with every piece of knowledge the diary had to offer. The villagers would not understand, they would see her as cursed, just as they had her aunt. But she no longer cared about their judgment. This was her burden to bear. A cycle of fear. Days turned to weeks, and the isolation began to take its toll. The whispers never ceased, a constant reminder of the shadow's presence. They called to her in her dreams, showing her visions of despair and darkness. They tempted her with promises of release, of freedom from her duty. But Eliza held firm, her determination unyielding. Then one night, the portal's hum grew louder. The shadows pressed against its edges, their forms flickering and writhing. Eliza stood her ground, her salt barriers glowing faintly in the dark. She recited the incantation she had memorized, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her heart. The shadows retreated, their whispers fading into silence. But Eliza knew it was only temporary. They would return, stronger and more determined. She could only hope that she would be ready when they did. A new inheritor. Months later, the cottage stood silent, its windows dark and lifeless. The villagers whispered among themselves, sharing rumors of Eliza's disappearance. Some claimed she had fled, unable to bear the weight of her aunt's legacy. Others believed the shadows had finally claimed her, dragging her into their world. The truth was far stranger. Eliza had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the diary and the faint hum of the portal. The villagers dared not approach the house, fearing the curse that hung over it. Then, one day, a young man arrived in the village. His name was Adam, and he had come to claim the house he had inherited from a distant relative. The villagers watched him with pity, knowing the fate that awaited him. They warned him, just as they had warned Eliza, but their words fell on deaf ears. Adam moved into the cottage, oblivious to the danger lurking within. On his first night, he was awoken by a faint whisper. Adam, it called, soft and insidious. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their malevolent presence. The shadows began to gather, their forms flickering in the corners of his vision. The cycle had begun again. Epilogue. Far away, in the depths of the shadow realm, Eliza stood watch. She could see the cottage through the veil, the new occupant fumbling in fear. Her heart ached for him, but she knew she could not interfere. Her duty was to the portal, to ensure the shadows did not escape. The whispers surrounded her, a constant reminder of her burden. They mocked her, taunted her, but she stood firm. One day, she told herself. One day, the cycle would end. Until then, she would endure. For the shadows might be eternal, but so was her resolve. Friends, this story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. The locations, characters, and events depicted are not real. Any resemblance to actual places, persons, or events is purely coincidental. The intent of this story is not to offend anyone's sentiments or promote superstition. Please regard it as a work of fiction. If you enjoyed this story and want more thrilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more spine-chilling content.